I was worth exactly £1 to the man I had loved for 7 years. 1 single pound, announced before the cold eyes of society, as if my devotion had been weighed on a scale and found to be nothing more than a coin tossed to a beggar. The morning of the reading began with rain. I remember standing at the window of Ashworth Hall, watching the grey curtain fall over the gardens I had tended with my own hands, the roses I had planted the spring after our wedding, now bowed under the weight of the downpour. I had not slept. The black crepe of my morning dress felt heavy against my skin, and the house, which had never truly felt like mine, seemed even more foreign now that Philip was gone. He had died 11 days prior, taken by a fever that consumed him in less than a fortnight. I had sat by his bedside through every hour, pressing cool cloths to his burning forehead, speaking soft words he never acknowledged. Even in his final moments, his eyes had looked past me, as if searching for someone who was not there. I told myself it was the delirium. I told myself many things in those years. The lawyer arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. Mr. Thaddeus Blackwood was a thin man, with spectacles that magnified his pale eyes to an unsettling degree. He carried a leather case beneath his arm, as if it contained something precious, though I would soon learn it held only the instrument of my destruction. I greeted him in the entrance hall, my voice steady, my hands clasped before me in the manner I had perfected as the Countess of Wrenbury. I had expected a private reading. I had expected the quiet dignity of a widow receiving her due. Instead, I found the drawing room already occupied. Lady Prudence Ashworth, Philip's younger sister, sat in the chair nearest the fire, her mourning dress impeccable, her expression one of barely concealed anticipation. Beside her stood her husband, Sir Reginald Whitmore, a man whose ambition had always exceeded his inheritance. And in the corner, almost hidden by the shadow of the heavy drapes, sat a figure I did not recognize at first. A woman, younger than myself, with auburn hair gathered beneath a modest bonnet. She did not look at me when I entered. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, as if she were praying. I should have known then. I should have felt the warning in my bones. But I was still the Countess of Wrenbury, still the wife who had managed this household with grace and precision for 7 years, and I walked to my seat with my head held high. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault against the windows. He began with the formalities, the legal language that wrapped around the room like smoke. I listened without truly hearing, my mind drifting to the last conversation I had shared with Philip before his illness. He had spoken of a business matter, something about papers he needed to sign. I had not asked questions. I had learned early in our marriage that Philip did not welcome questions. Then Mr. Blackwood spoke my name, and the room grew very still. To my wife, Eleanora Ashworth, Countess of Wrenbury, I leave the sum of £1 sterling. I did not move. I did not breathe. I thought perhaps I had misheard, that the words had tangled somewhere between the lawyer's lips and my ears. But then I saw Lady Prudence's face, the smile she could not quite suppress, and I understood that I had heard correctly. £1. The room tilted. I gripped the arm of my chair, my knuckles white against the dark wood. Mr. Blackwood continued reading, his voice as flat and indifferent as if he were reciting a grocery list, and each word was a blade pressed against my throat. The entirety of my estate, including Ashworth Hall and its grounds, the London residence at Belgrave Square, all investments, properties, and liquid assets totaling approximately £50 million, I bequeathed to Miss Marguerite Sinclair in recognition of her faithful companionship and devotion. The woman in the corner lifted her head. For one moment, our eyes met. Hers were the color of winter skies, pale and distant, and in them I saw something I did not expect, not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to sorrow. Then Lady Prudence laughed. It was a small sound, quickly stifled, but it echoed through the room like a gunshot. Sir Reginald placed a hand on her arm, a warning, but the damage was done. The humiliation was complete. I rose from my chair. I do not know how my legs supported me. I do not know how I found the strength to speak, but I heard my own voice, thin and strange, asking the question that burned in my chest. Who is she? Mr. Blackwood looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. His expression held neither sympathy nor judgment. He was merely a messenger, delivering news that would shatter my life as completely as a stone thrown through glass. Miss Sinclair was a companion to Lord Ashworth, he said carefully. She attended to certain matters of his household. I wanted to scream. I wanted to overturn the table, to tear the document from his hands and cast it into the fire. But I was still the Countess of Wrenbury, or what remained of her, and so I simply stood there, my body trembling beneath the weight of my black crape, while the rain fell and the fire crackled, and the world I had known dissolved into nothing. Lady Prudence rose, smoothing her skirts with practiced elegance. She crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could smell the lavender water she favored, close enough that only I could hear her words. "You must have known," she whispered. "Surely you were not so blind. He never loved you, Eleanora. He married you for your connections, and now that father is dead and your family's influence has waned, you are simply unnecessary." She smiled, and in that smile I saw every slight, every whispered insult, every cold reception I had endured since the day I became Philip's wife. The Ashworths had never accepted me. I had been tolerated, nothing more, and now even that tolerance had reached its end. I turned away from her. I could not bear to look at her face a moment longer. Instead, I looked at Marguerite Sinclair, this woman who had stolen my life, and I saw that she was crying. Silent tears tracked down her pale cheeks, and her hands, still folded in her lap, were shaking. It made no sense. None of this made sense. Mr. Blackwood was gathering his papers, preparing to leave. The reading was finished. The verdict had been delivered. I was no longer the Countess of Wrenbury. I was no longer anything at all. I walked out of the drawing room without a word. I climbed the stairs to the bedchamber I had shared with Philip, though he had rarely slept there, preferring his own rooms at the far end of the corridor. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. £1. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that rose in my throat. 7 years. 7 years of managing this household, of hosting dinners and entertaining guests, of lying alone in this bed while my husband found his comfort elsewhere. 7 years of convincing myself that his coldness was merely his nature, that he would warm to me in time, that patience and devotion would eventually be rewarded. And my reward was £1. I do not know how long I stood there. The light shifted, the rain continued, and eventually I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. A knock, soft but insistent. "Lady Eleanora?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, one of the few members of the staff who had shown me genuine kindness. "Lady Eleanora, there is a carriage arrived for you. Your aunt, Lady Fairfax, has sent word. She wishes you to come to her at once." My aunt, Augusta Fairfax, my mother's sister, the only family I had left in this world. I had written to her the day after Philip's death, a brief letter informing her of the circumstances. I had not expected her to respond so quickly. I opened the door. Mrs. Pemberton stood before me, her weathered face etched with concern. She had been at Ashworth Hall for 30 years, longer than I had been alive, and she knew this house's secrets better than anyone. "I heard what happened, my lady," she said quietly. "I am sorry. Truly sorry." I nodded, unable to speak. She reached out and pressed something into my hand. A handkerchief, white and clean, embroidered with my initials. A small kindness in a sea of cruelty. "Your trunk is being prepared," she continued. "I took the liberty of having the maids pack your personal belongings. The new mistress has not yet given instructions regarding the household, but I thought it best to ensure your things were ready. The new mistress, Marguerite Sinclair, A woman I had never met, a woman whose existence I had never suspected, was now the owner of everything I had called home. "Thank you," I managed, "for everything." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes glistened. She had seen much in her years of service, but perhaps she had never seen anything quite like this. A wife cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single pound to her name. I descended the stairs for the last time. My trunk had been placed in the entrance hall, a modest thing compared to the grandeur that surrounded it. I looked around at the marble floors, the portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down from the walls, the crystal chandelier that caught the gray light of the afternoon. None of it had ever belonged to me. I understood that now. The front door opened, and the rain-scented air rushed in. A footman stood waiting beside the carriage, an umbrella held aloft. I walked toward the door, my head high, my steps measured, determined to leave this place with whatever dignity remained. And then I saw him. A man stood at the foot of the steps, his dark coat glistening with rain, his hat pulled low against the weather. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face I recognized from the few social gatherings Philip had deigned to attend with me. Lord Sebastian Harcourt, the Viscount of Thornfield. He had been a friend of Philip's once, years ago, though I had noticed their friendship had cooled of late. He looked up as I emerged, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or something else entirely, something I could not name. "Lady Ashworth," he said, and his voice was low, rough, as if the words cost him effort. "I came as soon as I heard. I am deeply sorry for your loss." I wanted to laugh. My loss, as if I had lost anything more than an illusion. "Thank you, Lord Harcourt," I said, "but I fear your condolences are misplaced. It seems I have lost far more than a husband." He frowned, confusion darkening his features. I did not wait for him to respond. I walked past him, down the steps, into the waiting carriage. The footman closed the door behind me, and I sank against the velvet seat, my body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building for days. The carriage lurched forward. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Ashworth Hall grow smaller, its gray stones fading into the mist. And standing on the steps, still as a statue, was Lord Sebastian Harcourt watching me go. I did not know then that he would be the one to unravel the truth. I did not know that the path ahead would lead me through darkness before I found the light. I knew only that I was leaving behind everything I had been, and that somewhere, in the ruins of my former life, a new story was waiting to begin. The rain fell harder, and the carriage carried me away toward my aunt's house, toward an uncertain future. But as the wheels turned and the miles stretched between me and my humiliation, a single thought crystallized in my mind, sharp and clear as a winter star. I would discover the truth about Marguerite Sinclair. I would understand why Philip had done this. And I would not rest until I had reclaimed not my fortune, but something far more valuable: my name. My aunt's house stood at the edge of Hampstead, a modest but elegant Georgian residence, surrounded by gardens that had been my refuge as a girl. I had spent summers here before my marriage, reading beneath the willow tree, walking the gravel paths with my mother before consumption claimed her. Now, as the carriage rolled through the iron gates, I felt as though I were returning not to a sanctuary, but to the scene of my own funeral. Lady Augusta Fairfax was waiting on the front steps despite the rain. She was 63 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of bearing that made younger women straighten their spines in her presence. She had been widowed twice, first by a baron who left her comfortable, and then by a wealthy merchant who left her rich. Society whispered that she had buried her husbands with the same efficiency she applied to everything else, but I knew the truth. She had loved them both in her way, and she had survived them both with her dignity intact. She did not speak as I descended from the carriage. She simply opened her arms, and I walked into them, And for the first time since Mr. Blackwood had read those terrible words, I allowed myself to weep. We stood there in the rain, my aunt holding me as I had not been held since I was a girl, her hand stroking my hair while the sobs tore through my body. She did not offer empty comfort. She did not tell me that everything would be well. She simply held me until the storm inside me had passed. And then she led me into the warmth of her house. The drawing room was exactly as I remembered it, filled with books and comfortable furniture and the faint scent of the roses she cultivated in her greenhouse. A fire blazed in the hearth, and a tea service had been laid out on the table near the window. My aunt guided me to the settee and pressed a cup of tea into my trembling hands. "Drink," she commanded. "Then you will tell me everything." I drank. The tea was hot and strong, laced with honey, and it steadied me enough to speak. I told her about the reading, about the £1, about Marguerite Sinclair and the £50 million that should have been my security. I told her about Lady Prudence's whispered cruelty and the strange sorrow I had seen in Marguerite's eyes. I told her everything, and when I was finished, my aunt sat back in her chair and regarded me with an expression I could not decipher. "Marguerite Sinclair," she repeated slowly. "The name is not familiar to me." "Nor to me," I said. "I never heard Philip speak of her. I never saw her at any gathering. I do not understand how she could have been so important to him that he would leave her everything." My aunt was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled, and outside, the rain had begun to ease, leaving the gardens dripping and gray. "There are things you do not know about your husband," she said finally. "Things I chose not to tell you, because I hoped they would not matter, because I hoped he would treat you with the respect you deserved, regardless of the circumstances of your marriage." I set down my teacup. My hands had begun to tremble again. "What things?" My aunt rose and crossed to the window, her back to me. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, as if she were choosing each word with deliberate precision. "Before your engagement was announced, there were rumors about Philip Ashworth, rumors that he had formed an attachment to a young woman of no particular family, a governess in the household of one of his cousins. The affair was said to be serious, so serious that his father threatened to disinherit him if he pursued it. The old earl was determined that Philip would marry well, would strengthen the family's position. And Philip, whatever his feelings may have been, was not willing to sacrifice his inheritance for love." I stared at her. A governess. Could it be Marguerite? "I do not know," my aunt said, turning to face me. "The rumors faded after your engagement was announced. The young woman disappeared, and no one spoke of her again. I assumed the matter was finished. I assumed Philip had done his duty and put the past behind him. But he had not," I whispered. "He had kept her. All these years he had kept her somewhere, hidden from me, hidden from society." "It would explain much," my aunt agreed. "His coldness toward you, his frequent absences, the separate bedchambers. I thought of all the nights I had lain alone, wondering where my husband was, telling myself that his distance was simply his nature. I thought of the way he had looked past me on his deathbed, searching for someone who was not there. Had he been searching for her? Had his last thoughts been of Marguerite Sinclair while I sat beside him, holding his hand, believing myself to be his wife in more than name? The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined possible. Not because I had loved Philip, not in the way I had once hoped to love him, but because I had given him everything I had, my youth, my loyalty, my future, and he had taken it all while dreaming of another woman. "What am I to do?" I asked, and my voice sounded small, lost, like that of a girl rather than a woman of 28. My aunt returned to her chair and took my hands in hers. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady. "First you will rest," she said. "You will eat, you will sleep, and you will allow yourself to grieve. Not for Philip, but for the life you thought you had. Then, when you are ready, we will discover the truth. If this woman was his mistress, if she manipulated him in his final days to steal what should have been yours, we will find evidence. We will challenge the will if we must." "Can a will be challenged?" I asked. My aunt smiled, and there was something fierce in that smile, something that reminded me why society both admired and feared her. "Anything can be challenged, Eleanora, if one has the will to fight. The question is whether you have that will, whether you are prepared to face scandal, gossip, and the judgment of those who would rather see you fade quietly into obscurity." I thought of Lady Prudence's smirk, of the whispers that would already be spreading through London's drawing rooms. I thought of the life that stretched before me, dependent on my aunt's charity, pitied by those who had once envied my position. And I thought of Marguerite Sinclair's tears, the sorrow in her pale eyes, the way she had not looked at me with triumph, but with something closer to grief. There was a mystery here, a story I did not yet understand. And I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I could not simply walk away from it. "I will fight," I said, "not for the money, not for the house, but for the truth. I need to understand why he did this. I need to know who she is." My aunt nodded, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "Good. Then we begin tomorrow. Tonight, you rest." She summoned the housekeeper to show me to my room, a comfortable chamber overlooking the garden. A fire had been lit, and fresh flowers stood in a vase on the dresser. My trunk had already been unpacked, my few possessions arranged with care. I stood at the window, watching the last of the daylight fade, and tried to imagine what the coming days would bring. I did not have to imagine for long. The following morning, as I sat at breakfast with my aunt, picking at toast I had no appetite to eat, the butler appeared in the doorway with a silver tray. "A card, my lady," he said, addressing my aunt. "Lord Sebastian Harcourt requests the honor of calling upon Lady Ashworth. He says the matter is urgent." My aunt's eyebrows rose. She glanced at me, then at the card, then back at me. "Lord Harcourt," she murmured. "The Viscount of Thornfield. He was a friend of your husband's, was he not?" "They knew each other," I confirmed, though I believe they had grown apart in recent years. My aunt considered this for a moment, then nodded to the butler. "Show him in." I had not expected to see Sebastian Harcourt again so soon. I had not expected to see him at all, truth be told. He had been a peripheral figure in my married life, appearing occasionally at dinners or balls, always polite but never familiar. I knew little about him beyond the basic facts that society provided. He was a widower. His wife had died young, though I did not know the circumstances. He was wealthy, titled, and respected, but he kept largely to himself, rarely participating in the social whirl that consumed so many of his peers. He entered the drawing room with the same quiet intensity I had noticed the day before. In the clear morning light, I could see his features more clearly. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. There were lines around those eyes, the kind that came from worry or grief, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was not a man accustomed to uncertainty. "Lady Fairfax," he said, bowing to my aunt. "Lady Ashworth. Thank you for receiving me." My aunt gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. You mentioned the matter was urgent." He sat, but he did not relax. His body remained tense, coiled, as if he were preparing for battle. "I must speak plainly," he said. "What I am about to tell you may seem presumptuous, even inappropriate, but I believe Lady Ashworth deserves to know the truth, and I fear I may be the only one willing to tell her." I leaned forward, my heart quickening. "What truth?" He met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw something unexpected. Regret. Deep, profound regret. As if he carried a burden he had been longing to set down. "I knew about Marguerite Sinclair," he said. "I have known for years, and I should have told you long ago." The words hung in the air between us. My aunt set down her teacup with a sharp click. I could not move, could not speak, could only stare at this man who had just admitted to knowing about my husband's betrayal while I remained ignorant. "Explain yourself," my aunt said, her voice cold. Lord Harcourt nodded, accepting the rebuke as his due. "Philip and I were friends at Oxford," he began. "Close friends, or so I believed. He confided in me about many things, including his feelings for a young woman named Marguerite. She was a governess, as you may have heard. They met when she was employed by his cousin's family. Philip was. Different then. Warmer, more open. He spoke of marrying her, of defying his father's wishes." "And what happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "His father discovered the affair. The old Earl was a hard man, ruthless in his ambitions. He dismissed Marguerite from her position and threatened to cut Philip off entirely if he pursued her. Philip was given a choice. He could marry a woman of appropriate standing and secure his inheritance, or he could follow his heart and lose everything. He chose the inheritance," I said. "He chose me." Lord Harcourt's expression flickered with something that might have been pain. He chose what he believed was his duty, and I believe he intended to honor that choice, to be a good husband to you. But he could not forget her. He never stopped. He never stopped loving her. The words should have wounded me. They did wound me, in a distant way, like a bruise pressed when the initial pain has already faded. But more than pain, I felt a strange relief. The coldness I had endured, the distance that had always separated us, it had never been about me. It had been about her, about a love he could not release. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked. "All these years, you knew. You could have warned me." Lord Harcourt rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to us. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I wanted to. You cannot imagine how many times I considered it, but I told myself it was not my place. I told myself that Philip would find his way back to you. That time would heal the wounds of his past. And I told myself." He stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. "I told myself that my motives were not entirely pure." "What do you mean?" my aunt demanded. He turned to face us, and in his eyes I saw something that stole my breath. "I have admired Lady Ashworth since the day I met her," he said quietly. "I have watched her navigate the difficulties of her marriage with grace and dignity, and I have wished, more times than I can count, that circumstances had been different, that I had met her first, that she had been free." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, pounding against my ribs. My aunt cleared her throat. "Lord Harcourt, these are extraordinary revelations." "I know," he said, "and I do not expect anything in return for making them. I simply could not bear to see Lady Ashworth suffer without understanding why. She deserves to know that her husband's failures were his own, not hers. She deserves to know that she did nothing wrong." I rose from my chair. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced myself to stand, to face him. "Thank you," I said, "for your honesty. I understand what it must have cost you." He shook his head. "It cost me nothing compared to what you have lost. And there is more I must tell you. About Marguerite. About what truly happened between them." "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me everything." He glanced at my aunt, who nodded her permission. Then he turned back to me, and in his storm-gray eyes, I saw the beginning of a truth I had never suspected. "Marguerite Sinclair was not merely Philip's mistress," he said. "She was his first wife. They married in secret, years before he ever met you. And when his father discovered the truth, he did not simply separate them. He destroyed them both." The room seemed to tilt. I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just heard. "His wife," I repeated. "She was his wife." Lord Harcourt nodded gravely. "And that, Lady Ashworth, is why the will cannot be challenged. because in the eyes of God, if not the law, you were never truly married to Philip at all. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and I stood frozen in my aunt's drawing room, realizing that everything I had believed about my life had been a lie from the very beginning. His first wife. The words echoed through my mind like the tolling of a funeral bell, each repetition driving the truth deeper into my consciousness. I had not been betrayed by a mistress. I had been replaced by a ghost, a woman whose claim to Philip preceded my own by years, a woman who had loved him when love still lived in his heart. My aunt had risen from her chair, her face pale but composed. She crossed to a cabinet near the window and poured 3 glasses of sherry with hands that trembled only slightly. She pressed one into my grasp and another into Lord Harcourt's before taking her own seat once more. "You will explain this thoroughly," she said to him, her voice leaving no room for refusal. "Every detail, from the beginning." Lord Harcourt took a long breath. He had not touched his sherry. His eyes remained fixed on some distant point, as if the memories he was about to share existed in a place only he could see. "I met Philip at Oxford, as I mentioned," he began. "We were young, idealistic, full of grand notions about the world. His father had raised him to value duty above all else, but Philip had a romantic streak that his upbringing could never quite suppress. When he met Marguerite, he fell completely. She was everything society told him he should not want. Poor, unconnected, dependent on her position as a governess for her very survival. But she was also kind and intelligent and beautiful, and Philip saw in her a future that had nothing to do with his father's ambitions. I listened, my sherry untouched, my heart aching for a version of Philip I had never known. They married in secret," Lord Harcourt continued. "A small church in the countryside, with only myself and Marguerite's elderly aunt as witnesses. Philip believed that once the deed was done, his father would be forced to accept it. He underestimated the old Earl's ruthlessness." "What did his father do?" I asked. Lord Harcourt's jaw tightened. "He discovered the marriage within a fortnight. I do not know how. Perhaps a servant spoke, perhaps a rumor reached the wrong ears. But the Earl acted swiftly. He had the marriage annulled on grounds of fraud, claiming that Marguerite had misrepresented herself to secure Philip's fortune. It was a lie, of course, but the Earl had powerful friends, and Marguerite had no one to defend her. The church records were altered. The witnesses were paid to forget. Within a month, it was as if the marriage had never existed. But it did exist, I said. In the eyes of God, as you said." "Yes," Lord Harcourt agreed quietly. "And in the eyes of Philip, who never forgave himself for failing to protect her. He was given a choice, just as I told you. Accept the annulment, marry appropriately, and preserve his inheritance. Or refuse, be disinherited, and spend the rest of his life fighting a battle he could not win. He chose surrender. He told himself it was for Marguerite's sake, that she would be better off without him, that his father would destroy her utterly if he continued to resist. But I believe the truth was simpler. He was afraid. Afraid of poverty, afraid of disgrace, afraid of becoming nothing." "And Marguerite?" my aunt asked. "What became of her?" "She disappeared," Lord Harcourt said. "Philip tried to find her in those early years. He hired investigators, followed every rumor. But she had vanished completely, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. He assumed she had left England, perhaps gone to the continent or to America. He mourned her as if she had died. But she had not died," I said. "She was here. All along, she was here." Lord Harcourt nodded. "I do not know when Philip found her again, or how. He ceased confiding in me years ago, around the time of your marriage. I believe the guilt was too great. He could not face me, knowing what I knew, knowing what he had done to both of you." I rose from my chair and walked to the window. The garden stretched before me, green and peaceful, utterly indifferent to the turmoil within my breast. I had spent 7 years married to a man who had never truly been mine. 7 years believing that patience and devotion would eventually unlock his heart, when all along that heart had belonged to someone else. And yet, strangely, I did not feel anger toward Marguerite. I felt something closer to kinship. We had both been victims of Philip's weakness, of his father's cruelty, of a society that valued wealth and position above love and truth. She had lost him first. I had lost him second. And now, in the wake of his death, we were both left to pick up the pieces of lives he had shattered. I must speak with her, I said, turning back to face the room. I must hear her side of this story. Lord Harcourt and my aunt exchanged a glance. That may not be wise, my aunt cautioned. The woman has just inherited 50 million pounds. She has no reason to speak with you, and every reason to guard her secrets. Nevertheless, I said firmly, I cannot move forward without understanding the full truth. And there are questions only she can answer. Lord Harcourt set down his untouched sherry and rose. If you are determined to see her, I will arrange it. Marguerite and I have corresponded over the years. She trusts me, or trusted me once. I can write to her today and request a meeting on your behalf. You would do that? I asked, surprised by his willingness to help. He met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw something that made my breath catch. I would do a great deal more than that, Lady Ashworth, he said quietly. If you would allow me. The words hung between us, weighted with meaning I was not yet ready to examine. My aunt cleared her throat, breaking the spell. Write your letter, Lord Harcourt, she said briskly. We shall await Miss Sinclair's response. In the meantime, Eleanora must rest. She has endured more than enough for one morning. Lord Harcourt bowed and took his leave. I watched from the window as his carriage departed, my thoughts swirling like leaves in an autumn wind. He had known. All these years, he had known the truth about my marriage, and he had said nothing. And yet, he had come forward now when I needed answers most. Why? Out of guilt? Out of some sense of honor? Or out of something else, something he had hinted at but not fully spoken? I remembered his words. I have admired Lady Ashworth since the day I met her. I have wished that circumstances had been different. It was too much to consider, too much to feel. I turned away from the window and allowed my aunt to guide me back to my room, where I lay down upon the bed and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally claimed me. The response from Marguerite Sinclair arrived 3 days later. I had spent those days in a fog, wandering my aunt's house like a ghost, unable to settle to any task. I tried to read, but the words swam before my eyes. I tried to walk in the garden, but the paths seemed to lead nowhere. My aunt watched me with concern, but did not press. She understood, I think, that I was in mourning, not for Philip, but for the woman I had been, the Countess of Wrenbury, the devoted wife, the respectable lady whose future had seemed, if not happy, at least secure. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone I did not yet recognize, someone who had been deceived, humiliated, and cast aside. Someone who had nothing left but the truth and the determination to find it. Lord Harcourt delivered the letter himself. He stood in my aunt's drawing room, rain-damp and serious, and handed me a cream-colored envelope sealed with plain wax. She has agreed to see you, he said, tomorrow afternoon at her residence. She asks only that you come alone. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, each stroke precise and controlled. Dear Lady Ashworth, I read aloud. I have long expected this meeting, though I confess I hoped it would never come. There is much between us that words cannot easily bridge, but I believe you deserve to know the truth as much as I deserve to speak it. Come to me tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Come alone, if you can bear it. And know that whatever anger you carry toward me, I carry toward myself tenfold. Yours, in shared grief, Marguerite Sinclair. I lowered the letter and looked at Lord Harcourt. She speaks of shared grief. She mourns him as much as you do, he said. Perhaps more. She loved him longer. It was a simple statement, without judgment or accusation, and yet it pierced me like a blade. She had loved him longer. She had loved him first. And in the end, he had returned to her, leaving me with nothing but a single £1 and a lifetime of questions. "I will go," I said. "Tomorrow, alone as she asks." My aunt protested, but I held firm. This was something I needed to do myself, without protectors or advocates. I needed to face Marguerite Sinclair as one woman to another, to see in her eyes whether she was the villain I had imagined or something else entirely. Lord Harcourt offered to have his carriage convey me, and I accepted. He did not argue when I refused his company. He simply nodded, as if he understood that some journeys must be made in solitude. The next afternoon was grey and damp, typical of an English autumn. I dressed carefully in a simple dark blue gown, wanting neither to appear as a supplicant nor as an aggressor. My aunt pressed a small vial of smelling salts into my hand, just in case, and then I was in the carriage, rolling through streets that blurred past the rain-streaked windows. Marguerite's residence surprised me. I had expected something grand, some indication of the fortune she had inherited. Instead, the carriage stopped before a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where respectable widows and retired governesses might live. There were lace curtains in the windows and a small pot of chrysanthemums by the door. It looked like a home, not a trophy. A maid answered my knock and led me to a parlor on the first floor. The room was comfortable, furnished with pieces that looked well-loved rather than expensive. Books lined one wall, and a writing desk stood near the window, its surface covered with papers and correspondence. A fire burned low in the grate, and beside it, in a high-backed chair, sat Marguerite Sinclair. She rose as I entered. She was smaller than I had expected, delicately built, with auburn hair now streaked with silver and eyes that were indeed the color of winter skies. She wore a simple gray dress, unadorned, and her only jewelry was a thin gold band on her left hand, a wedding ring. She still wore his ring. "Lady Ashworth," she said, and her voice was soft, musical, carrying traces of an accent I could not place. "Thank you for coming." I stood just inside the doorway, uncertain how to proceed. Every speech I had prepared, every accusation and demand, seemed to dissolve in the face of this quiet woman, who looked at me not with defiance, but with something close to compassion. "Please," she said, gesturing to a chair opposite her own. "Sit with me. Let me tell you what I should have told you years ago." I sat. The maid brought tea, which neither of us touched, and then Marguerite began to speak. "I loved Philip from the moment I met him," she said. "I was 20 years old, a governess with no family and no prospects, and he was the most beautiful man I had ever seen. Not just his appearance, though he was handsome then, before grief and guilt carved lines into his face. It was his spirit. He laughed so easily, and he looked at me as if I were something precious, something worthy of protection." She paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. "We married in secret, as Lord Harcourt told you. 3 weeks of perfect happiness, and then the Earl descended upon us like a storm. I will not trouble you with the details. Suffice it to say that I was threatened, bribed, and ultimately erased. The marriage was annulled, and I was given a choice: leave England forever and accept a modest settlement, or stay and be destroyed. I had no resources to fight, no family to protect me. I took the money and I fled." "Where did you go?" I asked. "France," she said, "then Italy, then Switzerland. I moved often, afraid that the Earl would pursue me even across borders. I taught languages, sewed, took whatever work I could find. I tried to forget Philip, to build a new life. But I never could, and he never forgot me either." She reached into a pocket of her dress and withdrew a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. "He found me 10 years ago," she said. "I do not know how. He wrote to me, begging my forgiveness, telling me that his father had died and that he was free at last. But by then, He was already married to you. I stared at the letters, my heart constricting. 10 years. He had been in contact with her for 10 years of our marriage, writing letters I never knew existed, carrying on a correspondence that must have contained everything he could not say to me. I told him to stay with you, Marguerite continued. I told him that he had made his choice and that he must honor it. But he could not let go. He visited me when he could, always in secret, always with the weight of guilt pressing upon him. We did not. She hesitated, color rising in her pale cheeks. We did not resume our marriage in the physical sense, if that is what you fear. That part of us died with the annulment. But the emotional bond remained. Perhaps it was wrong of me to allow it. Perhaps I should have sent him away. But I was lonely, and I had loved him for so long. And some part of me believed we deserved at least that much. I sat in silence, absorbing her words. The jealousy I had expected to feel did not come. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness, for her, for Philip, and yes, for myself. The will, I finally said. Why did he leave everything to you? Marguerite's eyes glistened. He believed he owed me a debt he could never repay. All those years ago, his father's money destroyed our marriage. Philip wanted his death to set things right, to give me the security I had been denied. I did not ask for it. I did not want it. But he insisted, and in the end, I could not refuse him. It was his way of saying he was sorry. And the £1? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. What was that meant to say? She flinched as if I had struck her. That was not his intention, she said quietly. The original will left you the London house and a generous annuity. But his sister. Lady Prudence visited him in his final days. She convinced him to alter the terms, arguing that you had family who could support you while I had no one. I believe she preyed upon his guilt, his desire to make amends to me, and twisted it to her own purposes. Lady Prudence. Of course, I should have known that her cruelty in the drawing room was not merely opportunistic, but calculated. I do not want his money, Marguerite said suddenly, leaning forward with an intensity that surprised me. I never wanted it. I want only peace and the freedom to live out my remaining years without shame. If there is any way to make this right, to give you what you deserve, I will do it. I have already instructed my solicitor to draw up papers restoring the London house and a substantial income to your name. I stared at her, unable to speak. She was offering to share the fortune that had been stolen from me. She was offering to undo, as much as possible, the damage that Philip's weakness and Lady Prudence's malice had caused. Why? I finally managed. Why would you do this? She smiled, and in that smile I saw decades of sorrow, of longing, of love that had never been allowed to flourish. Because we are the same, Lady Ashworth, she said softly. Both of us loved a man who could not be what we needed him to be. Both of us gave our lives to a dream that was never quite real. And both of us deserve better than to spend our remaining years as enemies. Let us be allies instead. Let us take what remains and build something new. I looked at this woman, this supposed villain, and I saw only a fellow survivor. She had not stolen my husband. He had never truly been mine to lose. She had not plotted against me. She had simply loved and been loved, and suffered the consequences of that love with a dignity I could only admire. I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, but they gripped mine with surprising strength. I accept, I said. Not the money, not yet, but the alliance, and perhaps in time, the friendship. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the rain had stopped. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the parlor floor. And in that quiet room, two women who should have been rivals began instead to weave the fragile threads of understanding. I did not know then what the future held. I did not know that greater revelations awaited, that the truth about Philip's death was darker than I had imagined, that the path to healing would require more courage than I had ever summoned before. But I knew, as I left Marguerite's house that afternoon, that I was no longer alone. And for the first time since the reading of the will, that knowledge felt like enough. The days that followed my meeting with Marguerite carried a strange quality, as if I were emerging from a long illness into uncertain light. The world had not changed, and yet everything looked different. The bitterness I had nursed began to soften, replaced by something more complicated, a grief not for what I had lost, but for what had never truly existed. My aunt watched my transformation with cautious approval. She had expected me to return from Marguerite's house in fury, armed with ammunition for a legal battle. Instead, I returned quiet and contemplative, speaking little of what had passed between us, but carrying myself with a new resolve. "You have forgiven her," my aunt observed one evening as we sat together in her drawing room, the fire casting dancing shadows across the walls. "There was nothing to forgive," I replied. "She was as much a victim as I was, perhaps more so." My aunt considered this, her sharp eyes studying my face. "And what of your plans? Will you accept her offer to restore part of the estate?" I had thought long about this. Marguerite's solicitor had sent papers outlining the proposed arrangement. The London house at Belgrave Square, an annual income of £3,000, and a sum sufficient to establish myself independently. It was more than generous. It was, in truth, more than I deserved from a woman who owed me nothing. "I will accept enough to live comfortably," I said, "but not the house. Let her sell it if she wishes, or keep it for herself. I have no desire to return to a place that holds such painful memories." My aunt nodded slowly. "A wise decision. And what will you do with your comfortable life once it is secured?" I did not have an answer. For 7 years, my existence had been defined by my role as Philip's wife. Without that role, I was untethered, free but also adrift. I had no profession, no particular talents, no clear purpose. I was 28 years old, a widow in all but name, with a scandal attached to my reputation that would follow me wherever I went. "I do not know yet," I admitted, "but I believe I will find my way." The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the garden, walking among the roses my aunt cultivated with such devotion, when the butler appeared to announce that Lord Harcourt had called. I found him in the drawing room, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when I entered, and something in his expression made my heart quicken. There was urgency there, and beneath it something darker, fear. "Lady Ashworth," he said, "forgive my intrusion. I bring news that could not wait." "What news?" He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. Whatever he had to say, I would receive it on my feet. "I have been making inquiries," he said, "about Philip's final days, about the circumstances of his illness." I frowned. His illness. The physician said it was a fever, a sudden onset, too swift for treatment. "That is what we were told," Lord Harcourt agreed. "But I have spoken with the servants who attended him. I have spoken with the apothecary who prepared his medicines, and I have discovered certain irregularities." The room seemed to grow colder. I wrapped my arms around myself, though the fire burned steadily. "What sort of irregularities?" Lord Harcourt's jaw tightened. In the week before his collapse, Philip received several visits from his sister. Lady Prudence came to Ashworth Hall almost daily, sometimes staying for hours. The servants thought nothing of it at the time. She was his family, after all. But after each visit, Philip's condition worsened. I stared at him, unable to speak. The implications of his words were monstrous, too terrible to contemplate. "You cannot mean," I began. "I mean nothing yet," he said firmly. "I am merely reporting what I have learned. But there is more. The apothecary who prepared Philip's tonics has disappeared. His shop is closed. His residence empty. No one knows where he has gone. My legs suddenly felt weak. I sank into the nearest chair, my mind racing. Lady Prudence had always been cold to me, had always resented my place in her brother's life. But murder? Could she truly be capable of such a thing? Why? I whispered. Why would she do this? Lord Harcourt crossed the room and knelt before me, taking my hands in his. His grip was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm of my thoughts. The original will, he said quietly. Marguerite told you that Philip intended to leave you the London house and a generous income. But Lady Prudence convinced him to change it in his final days. If she knew about Marguerite, if she knew that the bulk of the estate would go to a woman with no legal standing to challenge the will, she would ensure that nothing went to me, I finished. She would ensure that Philip died before he could change his mind again. It is only a theory, Lord Harcourt cautioned. We have no proof, and without proof, we can do nothing. I looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw there a reflection of my own horror. He had come to me with this suspicion, not to frighten me but to warn me, to prepare me for a truth that might prove even more devastating than the ones I had already uncovered. What do we do? I asked. We find proof, he said simply. If Lady Prudence had a hand in her brother's death, there will be evidence. The apothecary may have fled, but he left records. The servants may know more than they have said, and Lady Prudence herself. He paused, his expression hardening. She is careless in her arrogance. She believes herself above suspicion. That arrogance may be her undoing. He rose, but he did not release my hands. For a long moment, we stood there, connected by more than the clasp of our fingers. I saw in his face the same emotions that swirled within my own breast. Determination, grief, and something else, something neither of us had yet dared to name. You do not have to involve yourself in this, I said softly. This is not your burden to bear. His expression softened. Anything that concerns you concerns me, Lady Ashworth. I thought I had made that clear. Eleanora, I said, surprising myself. If we are to be allies in this, you should call me by my name. He smiled. The first true smile I had seen from him, and it transformed his severe features into something almost tender. Eleanora, he repeated. Then you must call me Sebastian. Sebastian. The name felt strange on my tongue, intimate in a way that made my cheeks warm. I withdrew my hands gently, needing distance to think clearly. We must be careful, I said. If Lady Prudence suspects we are investigating her, she may destroy whatever evidence remains. Agreed, he said. I have already begun making discreet inquiries. I have contacts in London who can trace the apothecary's movements, and I believe Marguerite may be able to help. She knew Philip better than anyone. She may know secrets about his family that we do not. I nodded slowly. Then I will write to her today. I will tell her what you have discovered and ask for her assistance. Sebastian hesitated. There is one more thing, something I did not wish to tell you until I was certain. What is it? He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age. I found this among Philip's papers, he said. I have been serving as one of the executors of his estate alongside his solicitor. This was hidden in a compartment in his desk, a compartment the solicitor did not know existed. I took the document with trembling hands. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. It was a letter, written in Philip's hand, dated 3 months before his death. My dearest Eleanora, I read aloud, my voice catching on the words. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth I could never speak in life must finally be told. I have wronged you in ways that cannot be undone. I married you, knowing that my heart belonged to another, knowing that I could never give you the love you deserved. I told myself it was duty, but it was cowardice. I was afraid of my father's anger, afraid of poverty, afraid of the man I might become without the protection of my name and fortune. And so I sacrificed you, as I had already sacrificed Marguerite, on the altar of my own weakness. I stopped, unable to continue. Tears blurred my vision, and the letter trembled in my grasp. Sebastian moved closer, not touching me, but standing near enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. "There is more," he said gently. "When you are ready." I drew a shaking breath and forced myself to read on. "I have tried to make amends. The will I have drafted leaves you secure, as you should be. Marguerite will receive the bulk of the estate, not as a reward, but as restitution for the life I stole from her. And you, my wife in name if not in truth, will have enough to begin again, to find the happiness I could never give you. I ask only one thing. Do not hate me. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I hope, in time, you might understand that I was not a villain, only a man too weak to be the hero you needed. Yours, in regret and in hope, Philip." The letter ended there. I sat in silence, the paper clutched in my hands, tears streaming down my face. It was not an apology, not exactly. It was a confession, raw and honest, the words of a man who had finally found the courage to speak the truth, even if only to paper. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew what he had done to both of us." "Yes," Sebastian said, "and he tried, in his way, to make it right." "But Lady Prudence changed the will," I said, anger rising through my grief. "She took his final attempt at redemption and twisted it into one last cruelty." Sebastian nodded grimly. "Which is why we must find the proof of what she has done, not just for your sake or for Marguerite's, but for Philip's. He deserves to have his final wishes honored, even if he cannot defend them himself." I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my heart. In that moment, something shifted within me. The anger I had felt toward Philip, the sense of betrayal and abandonment, began to dissolve. He had been weak, yes. He had made choices that caused immeasurable pain, but he had not been malicious. He had not set out to destroy me. He had simply been a man, flawed and frightened, trying to navigate a world that offered him no good options. "I forgive him," I said, the words emerging before I had consciously chosen to speak them. "I forgive him." Sebastian's eyes glistened. He reached out and brushed a tear from my cheek, his touch feather-light. "You have a generous heart, Eleanora," he said softly, more generous than he deserved. I looked up at him, this man who had stood on the periphery of my life for so long, watching, waiting, carrying secrets he believed were not his to tell. I saw the lines of sorrow around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the quiet strength in his bearing. And I saw something else, a longing that mirrored my own, a hope he had kept carefully hidden until this moment. "Sebastian," I said, and my voice was steadier now, "when this is over, when we have found the truth and brought Lady Prudence to justice, what then?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he took my hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to my fingers that was both reverent and achingly tender. Then he said, "I would very much like the opportunity to court you properly, if you would allow it." My heart, which had been so battered by grief and betrayal, stirred with something it had not felt in years. Hope. Real, fragile, terrifying hope. "I would allow it," I said. His smile returned, brighter this time, and in it I glimpsed a future I had never dared to imagine. A future built not on duty or convenience, but on genuine affection, on shared understanding, on the kind of love that grows from adversity rather than despite it. "But first," I continued, rising from my chair with renewed determination, "we have work to do. Lady Prudence believes she has won. Let us prove her wrong." Sebastian offered me his arm, and together we walked from the drawing room into the pale autumn sunlight. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the possibility of failure. But I was no longer the woman who had stood in Ashworth Hall. trembling beneath the weight of public humiliation. I was Eleanora Ashworth, survivor of betrayal, seeker of truth, and I would not rest until justice was done. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not with thunder, but with the quiet rustle of paper and the trembling confession of a man who had carried his guilt too long in silence. 3 weeks had passed since Sebastian revealed his suspicions about Lady Prudence. 3 weeks of careful investigation, of discreet inquiries, of piecing together fragments of evidence like shards of a shattered mirror. Marguerite had proven invaluable, her knowledge of Philip's family revealing secrets that even Sebastian had not known. And my aunt, with her formidable network of society connections, had gathered whispers and rumors that painted an increasingly damning portrait of Lady Prudence Ashworth Whitmore. But it was the apothecary who provided the final piece. His name was Mr. Cornelius Finch, and Sebastian's contacts traced him to a shabby boarding house in Dover, where he had been hiding while awaiting passage to France. When confronted, he broke almost immediately, a small man with nervous hands and watery eyes who had never intended to become party to murder. "She came to me 6 months ago," he told us, his voice barely above a whisper. We had gathered in my aunt's drawing room, Sebastian and Marguerite and myself, to hear his confession. Lady Prudence. She said her brother was suffering from a nervous complaint, that he needed something to calm his spirits. I prepared a tonic, harmless enough, but then she returned, again and again, each time requesting something stronger. I grew suspicious, but she paid well, and I needed the money. He broke off, shame coloring his sallow cheeks. "What did you give her?" Sebastian demanded. Mr. Finch twisted his hands in his lap. "Arsenic," he admitted. "Small doses at first, enough to cause fatigue and confusion. But the final preparation..." He swallowed hard. It was enough to kill a man, if administered over several days. I did not know for certain what she intended. I told myself it was not my concern. But when Lord Ashworth died, and I heard the circumstances, I knew. God help me, I knew what I had done. I listened to his confession with a strange sense of detachment. The horror of what Lady Prudence had done should have overwhelmed me, but instead I felt only a cold clarity. She had murdered her own brother. She had poisoned him slowly, methodically, timing his death to coincide with the changes she had manipulated him into making to his will. And she had done it all while I sat beside his bed, holding his hand, believing I was watching a natural illness run its course. "Will you testify to this?" Sebastian asked the apothecary. "In a court of law?" Mr. Finch blanched. "She will destroy me. Her husband has powerful friends." "Her husband," Sebastian said grimly, "will be too busy saving himself to protect her. Sir Reginald Whitmore's finances are not what they appear. I have evidence that he has been embezzling from his business partners for years. When that becomes public, his powerful friends will abandon him like rats fleeing a sinking ship." The apothecary considered this, his watery eyes darting between us. "And if I testify, what protection can you offer?" Sebastian leaned forward. A new identity. Passage to America. Enough money to establish yourself in a respectable trade. You will never see England again, but you will be free of Lady Prudence and the consequences of your actions. It was more than the man deserved, but we needed his testimony. Without it, we had only circumstantial evidence, suspicions, and rumors that a clever barrister could dismiss. With it, we had a case that even Lady Prudence's connections could not suppress. Mr. Finch agreed. The scandal that followed was the greatest London had seen in a generation. Lady Prudence was arrested at her home in Mayfair, still in her dressing gown, her screams of outrage echoing through the fashionable street as constables led her to a waiting carriage. Sir Reginald attempted to flee, but was apprehended at the docks, his pockets stuffed with banknotes and forged documents. The newspapers feasted on the story for weeks, each edition revealing new details of corruption, greed, and fratricide. I did not attend the trial. I could not bear to sit in that courtroom. watching the woman who had orchestrated my humiliation and murdered my husband face the consequences of her actions. But Sebastian attended every day, and each evening he came to my aunt's house to report what had transpired. Lady Prudence maintained her innocence to the end. She insisted that Mr. Finch had acted alone, that she had never intended Philip any harm, that the changes to the will had been her brother's own idea. But the evidence was overwhelming. Letters in her own hand, discussing the apothecary's services. Testimony from servants who had witnessed her administering the tonic to Philip during her visits. Financial records showing payments to Mr. Finch that far exceeded the cost of any legitimate medicine. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to hang, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, a mercy I suspect she did not deserve, but which spared the Ashworth name from the final ignominy of a public execution. Sir Reginald received 15 years for his financial crimes, his protestations that he had known nothing of his wife's murderous schemes falling on deaf ears. And then, at last, it was over. I stood in my aunt's garden on the morning after the verdict, watching the autumn leaves drift down from the great oak tree that had shaded my childhood summers. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the last roses. I breathed deeply, feeling something loosen in my chest, a tension I had carried for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind me. I did not need to turn to know who approached. "It is finished," Sebastian said, coming to stand beside me. "Justice has been done." I nodded slowly. Justice. Such a small word for such a monumental thing. Philip's death had been avenged. His final wishes, as expressed in the letter he had hidden in his desk, would be honored. Marguerite had already begun the process of restoring my inheritance, not because the law required it, but because it was right. And Lady Prudence, who had believed herself untouchable, would spend the rest of her days behind prison walls. "How do you feel?" Sebastian asked quietly. I considered the question. How did I feel? Relief, certainly. Satisfaction that the truth had come to light. But beneath those expected emotions lay something more complex, a sadness that would not quite release its grip on my heart. "I feel as though I have reached the end of a very long journey," I said, "and now I must decide where to go next." Sebastian turned to face me. In the pale morning light, the silver at his temples gleamed, and his storm-gray eyes held a warmth I had come to cherish over these difficult weeks. "I have a suggestion," he said, "if you would hear it." I smiled despite myself. "You always have suggestions, Lord Harcourt." "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "We agreed, remember?" "Sebastian," I repeated, and the name felt right on my tongue, familiar and dear. "Very well. What is your suggestion?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. My breath caught. I knew what such boxes contained, had received one before from a man who had never truly meant the promise it represented. But this was different. Sebastian was different. "I know it is too soon," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know you have barely had time to grieve, to heal, to find yourself again. But I have loved you for 7 years, Eleanora. I have watched you from afar, admired your grace, mourned your unhappiness, wished with every fiber of my being that I could be the one to bring joy into your life. I do not ask for an answer now. I ask only for permission to hope." He opened the box. Inside lay a ring, not the ostentatious diamond that Philip had given me, but a simple band of gold set with a single sapphire, deep blue as a midnight sky. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She was a woman of great strength and greater kindness, and she would have loved you as I do. I offer it not as a demand, but as a promise. Whenever you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be waiting." I looked at the ring, at the man who held it, at the future that shimmered before me like sunlight on water. I thought of all I had lost, all I had suffered, all I had learned about myself in these terrible, transformative months. I thought of Philip, whose weakness had shaped my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. And I thought of the woman I had been when I married him, young and hopeful and utterly naive, believing that duty and devotion would be enough. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had stared into the abyss of betrayal and emerged not broken, but forged anew. I reached out and closed the velvet box, pressing it back into Sebastian's hands. His face fell, and I saw the hope in his eyes flicker and dim. Then I took his hands in mine and held them tightly. "Ask me again," I said. "Not someday, not when I am ready. Ask me now." He stared at me, disbelief and joy warring in his expression. "Eleanora, I have spent 7 years waiting for a happiness that was never going to come," I said. "I will not waste another moment. I know my own heart, Sebastian. I know what I want, and what I want is you." His breath caught. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He searched my face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that I was acting from impulse rather than conviction. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because slowly, wonderingly, a smile spread across his features, transforming him from a man burdened by longing into one illuminated by joy. "Then, Eleanora Ashworth," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," I said. "Yes, Sebastian. 1,000 times yes." He pulled me into his arms, and I went willingly, pressing my face against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against my cheek. He held me as though I were something precious, something he had dreamed of holding for years and could scarcely believe was finally his. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, while the autumn leaves fell around us like confetti and the morning sun painted the garden in shades of gold. We were married in the spring. It was a small ceremony, held in the chapel at Thornfield, Sebastian's estate in the Cotswolds. Marguerite attended, resplendent in dove-gray silk, her face alight with a happiness I had not seen there before. She had found her own peace in the months since Philip's death, using the fortune he had left her to establish a home for governesses who had fallen on hard times. It was her way of honoring the woman she had once been, of ensuring that others would not suffer as she had suffered. My aunt stood beside me as I spoke my vows, her sharp eyes glistening with tears she would never admit to shedding. She had lived to see me happy, truly happy, and I knew that whatever years remained to her would be brightened by that knowledge. And Sebastian, my Sebastian. He waited for me at the altar with such love in his gaze that I felt my heart might burst with the fullness of it. When he took my hand and slipped his mother's ring onto my finger, I knew that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not wealth, not position, not the approval of society, just this, just him. Just a love that had been patient enough to wait and brave enough to speak. We spent our wedding night at Thornfield, in a chamber filled with candlelight and the scent of spring flowers. Sebastian was gentle, reverent, treating me with a tenderness I had never known from Philip. And when at last we lay together in the quiet darkness, his arms around me, his breath warm against my hair, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt whole. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. Thornfield became my home in a way that Ashworth Hall had never been, its warm stone walls and rambling gardens welcoming me as if they had been waiting for my arrival. I learned to ride again, something I had given up during my marriage, and spent long afternoons exploring the countryside with Sebastian at my side. We talked of everything and nothing, of books and philosophy and the small details of daily life, building the foundation of a partnership that went deeper than mere romance. Marguerite visited often, and the friendship that had begun in such unlikely circumstances deepened into something rare and precious. We did not speak of Philip often, but when we did, it was without bitterness or recrimination. He had been a flawed man who had made terrible choices, but he had also been a man who had tried, in the end, to make amends. That was how I chose to remember him. And Lady Prudence? I tried not to think of her at all. She was a chapter closed, a darkness banished. I had forgiven Philip for his weakness, but I could not find it in my heart to forgive her for her cruelty. Perhaps that made me less virtuous than I should have been. Perhaps in time I would find the grace to release even that final remnant of anger. But for now, I was content to let her fade from my thoughts, a ghost that had no power over my future. On the first anniversary of our wedding, Sebastian took me to the garden at Thornfield, to the spot where he had proposed. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the warm June air, and the evening light slanted golden through the leaves of the old oak tree. "I have something for you," he said, drawing me down onto the stone bench where we had shared so many conversations. He placed a small package in my hands, wrapped in silk and tied with a ribbon. I opened it to find a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "For your story," he said. "The story of your life, from this moment forward. Whatever you wish to write, whatever dreams you wish to pursue, I will support you. You are not just my wife, Eleanora. You are the bravest woman I have ever known, and I want the world to know your strength as I do." I held the journal to my chest, overwhelmed by the gift and the love behind it. For so long my story had been written by others, by Philip, by Lady Prudence, by the rigid expectations of a society that valued women only for what they could provide to men. But now, at last, the pen was in my own hand. "I will write it," I promised, "every word." And I did. I wrote of sorrow and joy, of betrayal and redemption, of the long road from humiliation to happiness. I wrote of Philip and Marguerite, of Lady Prudence and Mr. Finch, of my aunt and Sebastian, and all the others who had shaped my journey. I wrote the truth as I had experienced it, without embellishment or self-pity. And when the final page was filled, I closed the journal and looked out over the gardens of Thornfield at the life I had built from the ashes of the one that had been taken from me. I had been worth £1 to a man who never knew my value. But I had found, at last, a love that was beyond price, and that, I understood now, was worth everything.